China eyeing a lot of the world right now with a bit of hunger in the eye, but the domestic problems on the inside of China, some of the policies instituted inside the communist regime are not just the stuff of disapproval, not just Cold War era mutterings and mumblings, but in this case, something that is truly out of a horror film. And few people have kept as close of an eye on some of these things as, of course, Jan Jekielek. He is the senior editor over at the Epoch Times, author of Killed to Order. Jan, thank you so much for joining us.
Tony, it's great to be here.
So you've written Killed to Order all about China's organ harvesting industry, and it is an industry, an entire complex built around one of the most disgusting and abhorrent human practices. Tell us a little bit about what brought you to this major investigation.
You know, back in 2006, I was working on China human rights issues. Actually, I was working in Thailand on an underground railroad, supporting it, that was bringing Chinese prisoners of conscience, typically religious dissidents, out through the Golden Triangle out of China through to Bangkok, where we were helping them get UN refugee status and not get deported back to China, which the Chinese were always trying to actually make happen. And I happened to be traveling to Poland at the time. I had an arrangement with the International Society for Human Rights. They ended up hiring me and we moved to Poland for a couple of years. But I was there, and at the time, a couple of things were starting to happen simultaneously. One of them was that there was a whistleblower. There was a woman whose husband basically had confessed to her after having nightmares and her saying, "I'm leaving the relationship, it's over," that he had removed 2,000 corneas from living people.
2,000?
2,000 corneas from living people. That is what Annie is the pseudonym. That is what she attested. And so this was one whistleblower that came forth saying there was this camp called Sujatun, basically in China, that was using Falun Gong practitioners as unwilling organ donors. And, you know, as you might imagine, this was, you know, kind of a shocking, and it was the first example of an allegation of this nature that started to have credibility, because we had been hearing about it for a while. But it was just, it's by its very nature, something that's very difficult to verify.
Now, just as a small interjection, kind of a question on these particular things. When you hear something like that, when you do some kind of an interview where someone makes a huge allegation along those lines, was the interview something that you had to do with this lady over a period of time because it was extremely emotional for her, or was it something that you were able to kind of sit and document in one stretch? This is kind of a professional question maybe, but I think it's fascinating.
It's a great question, actually. And so this woman was, you know, kind of obviously primary Chinese speaker. I was not doing the interview with her. I was actually, I was, in fact, as this was all coming out, I was traveling. I remember because at the same time, I think the interviews had just been done, right, with her. And by the way, there were multiple interviews, I'm aware, because I looked at them. So to answer your question, and because, you know, this wasn't something that we could casually publish, you know, yeah. Like this required, you know, we had people who were sort of experts at working with victims of crimes. We had, you know, there's a whole series of types of people trying to assess whether this is what the level of credibility of this knowledge was. But there's something that was happening simultaneously. And this was actually in Israel. There was a man who was the former head of the Israeli Transplant Association, Jacob Levy. He was also a heart transplant surgeon and a professor at Tel Aviv University of transplant surgery. And he had a patient that one day tells him, "I can't wait any longer for my heart transplant. I'm going to die. I've got it set up in China in 2 weeks." And Jakob kind of looked at him and said, I mean, I've talked to him about this, right? That's impossible. But the guy went and got his heart and came back as scheduled, as planned, with a new heart after a 2-week wait. And at this point, Jacob Levy basically made it his life mission to stop Israel from ever being involved in these sorts of things. Basically, he ended up getting these laws passed by 2008, which the law basically said that the socialized healthcare will not pay for anything in China when it comes to transplantation. And there was another element to it, which was if you want to get an organ, you have to be ready to give an organ, because they actually had a shortage in China as well. In Israel as well. So anyway, My point is there were these two completely independent things happening right around 2000, end of 2005, beginning of 2006, which told us there's something horrible happening when it comes to this organ industry in China. And at the same time, some of the research yielded ads. There were ads that we have archived now. They actually went down after we publicized this in 2006 that said, I can get you a new heart in a number of weeks if you pay the right amount of cash, right? So it wasn't, there's just all these multiple lines of evidence starting to come together that allowed us to say, okay, we believe what Annie said is true. We believe what Professor Levy said is true.
There's been a long-standing assertion that I've made regarding the technology sector and the infrastructure development regarding AI, or of course their hardware and software industries, that like many communist regimes, China does not create anything of their own. They simply steal from others and then mass produce in the most hodgepodge, glued together, duct taped together mannerisms. Of course, we saw this with DeepSeek, where they essentially took an earlier AI model and just made 30 of them and glued them together. We've, of course, seen this in how they set up Huawei to essentially be a bastard of Cisco and Dell. And now you have this, well, I shouldn't say now as in the future term. When I hear you describe this organ harvesting industry, in which you go into more detail about inside Killed to Order, now you have a transplant industry that in the most brutally disgusting manner possible to create a mass infrastructure in that country around organ harvesting is something that I think that if you would have told people about this at the turn of the century, they wouldn't have even held conscience to believe you.
To your point, one of the very excellent documentaries on this issue that came out some years ago. It's actually titled Hard to Believe for precisely this reason. But let me actually explain to you how it works, because
Please.
This is not your garden variety organ trafficking, black market organ trafficking that is horrible in itself. This is a whole different level, okay? And I think the best way to understand it is that you need to basically have a state actor. You need to have a body, an entity that can push massive coercive power through a population in various ways. One way is through being able to push propaganda into a population. Why is that important? Because most people are not psychopaths, surgeons, and so forth, right? They're not everyone's like excited to, for example, remove organs from living people, right?
Machiavellianism is not a natural trait of the human spirit.
No, and in fact, so this kind of what we would call either hate propaganda, or let's just say dehumanizing and demonizing propaganda, it kind of tricks the human mind into being able to do things that they wouldn't normally be able to do to their fellow man.
Like hyper-utilitarianism, right? What's the, like, nihilism to the max kind of a thing?
Yeah, well, absolutely. And actually the utilitarianism figures into here very importantly as a central theme in the book. I'll talk about that in a moment, right? So you have to be able to dehumanize a large group of people through your mass propaganda apparatus, right? Mm-hmm. And you also have to be able to incarcerate a really large group of people, like say 1 million or something like that.
Both hallmarks of any communist regime.
100%. And so this is what the Chinese Communist Party did to the Falun Gong in 1999. There was a spiritual discipline, a very unusual, very grassroots oriented, very bottom up, truthfulness, compassion, forbearance. This is what people were living. There were 70 to 100 million people that were suddenly, over the course of 10 years, basically doing it bigger than the Communist Party. Okay. And communist parties do not like things that are bigger than it, that don't expressly pledge fealty to the party. So the Jiang Zemin, at the time he was the dictator, he made it illegal. And he decided to persecute these people, to eradicate them, to use his language. Okay. And that's when they did what I just said. They pushed this propaganda through the system to justify persecuting 70 to 100 million people. By the way, that was the government estimate of the numbers, right? And then
my.
they incarcerated 1 million, 2 million. We don't know how many, but a heck of a lot of people. Okay. And then they started blood typing, tissue typing, organ scanning them. And this is how I told you about those ads, right? For the 2-week wait period. The only way that can happen, right? In a civilized society, someone has to have a catastrophic accident. They're not coming back, right? So, and then it's deemed acceptable to take those organs from this person that's almost dead and almost certainly going to be dead moments to pass them to someone else. And it has to be the right size. The tissues have to match the blood types. So it's rare and you have to wait. That's why people wait for long periods of time. But here, because there's all this organ scanning, tissue scanning, all of that's happened, that goes into a database and there's an incarcerated person ready to be killed to order once you pay that money, and they can be shipped and killed and transplanted basically on demand. That's what's happening over there.
God be with us. That is I've despised, as many have, the communist regime of China for a long time. Of course, as it's mutated from kind of its more traditional communist socialist sphere to more of a national socialist sphere, kind of similar in a lot of ways to kind of the Russian Federation, but in the Chinese fashion of their mass execution of individuals, to keep individuals not simply ID tagged by the crime that they may have committed in penitentiary, not just by any perhaps dietary requirements that they have, but by suggesting this is the kind of liver that they have, this is the blood type they have, these are the genetic preconditions that they have. So just in case a foreign or a local benefactor is willing to shell out the cash that the state gets a cut of, or the entirety of, to redistribute, that individual can then be, again, killed to order. So many of these book titles are often, stylized, hyped up perhaps in a way, but there are a few times that I see something in the title and the framing of a work like this, a documentary and investigation over, again, the long time that you've been studying and cataloging, and I can't imagine the psychological trauma that you faced looking through all of this horror and then walking around people that don't know what's going on. I don't think I've ever seen a more appropriate title. And I'm not just trying to, as the guy bringing you on for an interview, fluff you up or anything in this way. There are very few words to say other than just the appropriateness of how you're framing this.
I actually struggled with the cover a bit. I had a friend basically suggest that we put something that represents a lot of death, because this is what has actually happened, right? I have some, basically skeletal bones and stuff like that on the cover. And it was a big debate about this. Is this going to be serious enough? But the reason I decided to go with this cover is that I felt like, even though this is it feels very strong imagery, I feel it understates the reality, not overstates it, if anything, right? And you point this out incredibly, like we're talking about a huge scale, right? This is, and when you have this massive coercive power of the state, between 2000 and 2005, they were able to build thousands of transplant hospitals. Okay. So this is it, just the whole transplant industry grows geometrically from the time that the Falun Gong became incarcerated. And then when nobody really is kind of doing anything about it, it kind of plateaus by the late 2000s to about 60 to 90,000 transplants a year. Now, to frame that, 40,000 transplants in America was the record last year. Okay, so this is a large number of transplants that are happening, and the origin is basically unknown. They would tell people that they were death row prisoners, even though they denied using prisoners. But really, the most aggressive estimates of death penalty wouldn't even come close to basically describing the actual numbers of people that were getting these transplants in the hospital beds and so forth. And then 2014, 2015, we get there. Nobody's really done anything about it. There's even, organizations that have kind of been running cover for them in effect. There's different theories about why, but they add the Uyghurs as a second group of people where they dehumanize a large group of them up in the northwest, right, of China. And then they incarcerate another million or two, a very significant number, and they start working on them. And it may go further. And this is actually, I get the sense that you're Christian yourself. I was talking with a man named Pastor Bob Fu out of Midland, Texas, who helps a lot of basically Chinese Christian dissidents, religious dissidents,
Right.
especially when they come to America. We were just talking. I'm going to have him on my show, American Thought Leaders, very soon. And I've noticed an uptick in dehumanizing rhetoric against Christians alongside these big arrests like the Zion Church, Pastor Ezra Jean, and also like the controls being placed on Catholic clergy, all this. And he said, yes, that's what I only saw it as a kind of cursory, like because I'm sensitive to it. But he said, no, that's definitely happening. So I'm very concerned, right? Like we're kind of that this, they may be seeking other groups now to basically sort of put into this, evil machinery. All I can say is I hope we can have an impact here to prevent that from happening, because it's been happening, 26 years too long.
It is a horrifying thing to witness a foreign regime, any regime that is, you can see, laying out plans and pathways in order to, again, as we've seen in Nigeria, again, as we of course have seen in China, target Christians, because again, with the Abrahamic faiths specifically on Christianity, as well, of course, in Orthodox Judaism, the holy value of the soul is something that is an anathema to communist and state-run thought, because it is the opposite of the utilitarian view of humans as a biological machine providing organs, in this case, very, very much on the nose. And that kind of value, once imparted, cannot be taken. It can't be. It can't be retracted. Once that is a measure of worth that is shown on every human soul, that runs clear. But we're running a little bit short on time, regrettably. I did want to ask you one thing that I had prepared for this particular interview. So I am banned from entering the CCP. A little point of pride. And one of the reasons that I am banned is because I have long criticized Chinese academic publications, specifically among these, the Chinese Medical Journal, which just decides every other day to write something completely opposite to what they wrote the day before. 1984, as I have joked consistently regarding the Chinese and the Vietnamese administration's medical journals. The piece that I wanted to bring to your attention specifically is from 2016, in which the Chinese Medical Journal announced a new era of organ transplantation in China. And they begin specifically by condemning a U.S. House resolution, number 343 in 2016, I think in June, which they called false statements regarding organ transplantation in China, which indicated serious miscommunication and misjudgment between China and U.S. on the issue. And then they proceed through the rest of their medical explanation, the supplementary materials, to argue why it is important to create a state-run apparatus for what they call the ethical life-saving transplantation service to 1.3 billion Chinese people, based on an essentially what they call a requirement to participate in this transplantation system. They say one thing at the beginning of their little resolution in their medical journal, and then they immediately turn around and start trying to gaslight the rest of the world, as China has done, ad nauseum in eternity, for exactly what it is that you've outlined they plan to do. They're trying to make this a public good means. How long until this becomes some kind of policy that, good Lord, that Canada starts to implement along with its MAID program?
This is the horrible reality of engagement, right? Is that we influence each other in different ways, and the false narrative that we believed for so many years was that we were going to help China liberalize by pumping enough cash in, and the reality is that I think, and I argue this in a piece in the Baltimore Sun a couple of months ago, that it's through that engagement where we're training these surgeons. We have these deep partnerships and funding relationships in the transplant industry that they've actually been shifting us. And that's the reason that we've been having to close multiple transplant systems in America.
The American Medical Association has 13 direct agreements with the Chinese medical journal.
I didn't know that number until this moment, but that is absolutely astonishing. By the way, that timing that you mentioned, right? This was the time when they said they decided, actually, we were taking organs from prisoners, but we're not going to do it anymore. Okay, that was around the time when they said this. And there's a paper that was written by a man named Matthew Robertson, also published in his PhD thesis, I think a half a year ago now, which demonstrates that their so-called organ registry numbers that they published to show that they've now created an ethical transplant system are basically a perfect quadratic equation. In other words, the numbers were fudged and not in a particularly elegant way. It's almost like they're laughing at us.
I believe this was entered into the congressional record in the House just last year. And then, of course, we have endtransplantabuse.org, November of 2025, these 4 perspectives. We'll link that in the description below, along with, of course, obviously, your book and your work, and cannot thank you enough.
And it's at killedtoorder.com if you're interested in pre-ordering. It's going to be out March 17th. It's more than a book. I mean, truthfully, this is sort of a culmination of 20 years of work and a call to action. At the end, I put a couple of appendices where I talk, one, about when you hear people saying, hey, that can't be happening. I have a lot of good information about what people can know based on actual evidence. In one appendix, and in another one, some people are like, hey, what do I do? Whether you're a government official, whether you're right at the grassroots, whether you're in the middle, I have all sorts of things you can jump in and do in there. So
again, Jan, cannot thank you enough. I really, really appreciate the work that you have dedicated yourself to in one of the most egregious crimes against humanity, crimes against the children of God on this earth, the absolute disregard for the basic souls of man that you have dedicated this investigation to. Thorough, excellent work. Jan Jekielek, we will, of course, make sure that all of this is linked in the description below. The Epoch Times is lucky to have you as their senior editor. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you so much, Tony. Much appreciated.